Well, good evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my honor to be here tonight and to be talking with you about the prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Maybe not specifically reunification, but peace for sure. And before we get started, I would like to thank Mr. Lim and the Korean American Social Justice Organization here in Chicago for inviting me. Mr. Lim has been more than patient with me during the planning of this event, and I really appreciate his efforts. It's hard to believe that just a few months ago, there was a real and prevailing anxiety both in Washington and in Asia that we were one miscalculation away from triggering a second Korean War, one that could potentially go nuclear, causing enormous casualties, destruction, and devastation on the Korean Peninsula and in the region, as well as global economic, political, environmental, and social disruptions for years to come. Today, we are in a very different political space. In just 5 short months, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un went from being one of the world's most hated, feared, and villainous leaders, who perpetuates a system of brutal and totalitarian control over his people and consistently defies international laws and norms to pursue an illegal nuclear weapons program, to the golden boy that world leaders are now rushing to see. The dizzying speed at which Kim's image rehabilitation has taken hold raises questions about the sustainability of such attitudes. After all, it shows how fickle popular opinion can really be. But it also speaks to a deeper desire among the parties, and especially those in Asia, to change what has been over the past year largely war rhetoric and a proposition of sanctions or war into peace rhetoric, providing more positive incentives towards the desired path. And while I have always been a proponent of engagement, dialogue, and negotiation with North Korea, the way it transpires does matter to its ability to bring about positive, sustainable, and permanent solutions. The question that looms in the coming weeks, months, and years is, are we on the right path, or are we caught up now in political theater? So before we get too deep into North Korea specific issues, I do want to set some key contextual observations that may help you better understand where we are today, how we got here, and where we might be heading in the future. And the first point is that historically, while the Korean Peninsula holds enormous geopolitical and strategic value, the world has often approached the Korean Peninsula in the context of big power politics, not out of concern of the Korean people themselves. And this is not a new trend, as many of you here of Korean descent know. For centuries, the Korean Peninsula has been the apex of it. I'll be a little slower. For centuries, the Korean Peninsula has been the apex of proxy wars, big powers fighting for influence in the region, where Korea was simply in the way. In that process, because the emphasis was placed on big power interests, Koreans have often been seen or portrayed as lacking agency, that is, lacking the ability to exert power or to affect their own future. And as such, little care or attention has been placed on Korea's strategic interests and national security dilemmas. Instead, policies have often been couched in the context of US-China relations, China-Russia relations, Japan-China relations, and so forth. And certainly Koreans have learned this lesson well, having spent centuries fighting to have their voices heard and to stave off attacks from the bigger powers. They often describe themselves as the shrimp among whales, working hard not to be absorbed or crushed in a geopolitical sphere. So they have learned to play the big powers against each other and manipulate that strategic competition in order to protect or achieve its national interests. The second point to keep in mind is that the Korean Peninsula has often been of low priority to the United States. Yes, South Korea has become a major ally of the US, and US blood was shed in defense of the South from the North during the Korean War. However, unlike the rebuilding of Japan after World War II, the investment in South Korea's post-war economic reconstruction was less about rebuilding South Korea for South Korea's sake, and more about, one, staving off communism from taking over hold of a decimated peoples, and two, ensuring a local market for Japan as part of Japanese reconstruction. There was a slogan back in the post-war era that for every dollar spent in Korea, it was worth two. That is, it was helping rebuild Japan's economy. And while public rhetoric about the U.S. ROC alliance today pledges ironclad assurances and no daylight between stances, these phrases belie key challenges that exist today in issues over U.S. troop numbers in South Korea, military burden sharing, wartime operational control, trade imbalances, the THAAD policy, and of course, approaches to North Korea. And I can tell you, towards the end of the Obama administration, for instance, there were complaints in Washington of what they called Korea fatigue. That is, they were rather annoyed at the constant South Korean interventions, and especially those asking for the U.S. to take sides on historical disputes between Korea and Japan. And last year, during the beginning of the Trump administration, there were constant complaints from the South Koreans of Korea passing. That is, this anxiety that the U.S. was leaving South Korea out of the decision-making process on North Korea policy, consulting instead with Japan, China, even Russia, everyone except Seoul. So while public rhetoric and the U.S. ROC alliance projects unity and strength, the private discussions hold greater confrontation and concern. So U.S. interest in North Korea has been even less, only really being willing to address the issue in the wake of North Korean provocations, and otherwise setting it aside in deference to higher priority issues. This relatively agnostic approach to North Korea underpins how the situation has had time to evolve to the point it is today. And in many ways, you can characterize U.S. interest in North Korea around two key priorities. The first is preventing North Korea from attacking South Korea again in order to reunify the peninsula by force under the North's control. We fought that war once, and while it ended in stalemate on the peninsula, the South has been able to thrive under democracy, and the U.S. is committed to helping preserve that reality. The second is really preventing North Korea's ability to threaten the U.S. directly. And this point is especially important as it illustrates why this time around with North Korea is so different for the United States. North Korea has been working on building a nuclear weapons program for decades. They established a fissile material production capability in the 1980s. They first tested a nuclear device in 2006 and have conducted 5 subsequent tests. They have had large arsenals of short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, likely nuclear capable, that could hit targets in South Korea and Japan for years. But this time around, last year, the U.S. has woken up. And a large part of that wake-up call was when North Korea conducted its first successful flight test of an intercontinental ballistic missile that could, when operational, reach targets in the United States. That threat that our allies in the region, South Korea and Japan, have lived under for years, suddenly was internalized by the American people, and its priority level rose instantly to the top of America's national security agenda. So, understanding these core contextual realities, a lot of people like to use the analogy of the Rubik's Cube when trying to describe how we have approached solving North Korea's nuclear problem. You know, the Rubik's Cube, you keep twisting across and around and trying to get all the squares to line up. And I think this is a very apt description, but only half the story. So the U.S. dealing with North Korea has been like when you're trying to solve the Rubik's Cube. You get really frustrated, and so you set it down for a while and forget it's there. You may go back and try it again, but get frustrated more quickly the next time, and the next time, and the next time, until finally you stop trying. And then there's the people like me who don't like to admit defeat. So instead of trying to keep twisting and not getting anywhere, they get frustrated, and they start peeling those stickers off and putting them where they want them, hoping they stick so they can show all their friends that they solved it. So, yes, North Korea has been developing a nuclear capability for decades, but U.S. efforts to address this issue have had a lot of stops and starts along the way. In the Clinton years, for instance, you had the agreed framework negotiations to try and end the North's fissile material production facilities and prevent North Korea from developing into a full-fledged nuclear weapons program. And mind you, when the negotiations started, Between the operational 5-megawatt reactor and the larger reactors under construction, North Korea at that time had only a small stockpile of nuclear material, enough for maybe only a handful of weapons. But it was estimated to be able to produce enough weapons-grade plutonium for an arsenal of around 100 nuclear weapons by the year 2000. So the Agreed Framework was signed in 1994, the 5-megawatt reactor was shut down, and construction of the 2 other reactors stopped. And as these moves were made, reciprocal efforts to improve U.S. DPRK relations were moving forward, including even a visit by then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to start talks about setting up a U.S. embassy in Pyongyang. But challenges within the framework did arise on both sides. Construction of the 2 light water reactors that were being provided as an incentive for the North to give up its nuclear weapons program was slow, and shipments of heavy fuel oil were delayed. Additionally, it was discovered that North Korea was developing a clandestine uranium enrichment program, providing an alternate source of fissile material. And so, however, going back to our Rubik's Cube analogy, so instead of twisting and turning and trying to renegotiate within the Agreed Framework to deal with these issues then, when relations were at their peak and negotiations could still make a difference, there had been a change of U.S. administration from Clinton to Bush, and the Bush administration abrogated the agreement. Adding insult to injury, he then went on to call North Korea as part of the axis of evil, along with Iraq and Iran. And while we don't have time tonight to go into greater detail of what happened next, it is important to remember that in 2002, when the Agreed Framework ended, North Korea still only had enough fissile material for a handful of nuclear weapons. So, late in the Bush administration, the U.S. revisited negotiations with North Korea, although looking for quick wins as their time and patience were limited. In the Obama years, we saw a similar pattern. At the beginning of the presidency, negotiations over the Leap Day deal were hasty, coming back not with the written document outlining mutually agreed upon commitments, but 2 unilateral and loosely formulated statements delivered to their respective capitals with their own understandings of what the deal was. And this deal quickly fell apart when North Korea took advantage of a technicality in language, differences between ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles or rockets, and announced plans for a satellite launch just 3 weeks after the deal had been made. So the Obama administration's appetite to go through that difficult exercise again and potentially be betrayed in the process was very low. And with 2 consecutive conservative governments in South Korea posing hardline stances against North Korea, the administration once again set the issue aside, picking it up only every once in a while, turning the Rubik's Cube around, calculating the probability of success, and eventually setting it back down for an undetermined time. So over the past year, between the combination of Trump's maximum pressure and tough rhetoric, and Moon's sharp turn from playing along with that rhetoric to flinging the door to diplomacy wide open and running through, this hyper-summit process feels a lot now like we're peeling those stickers off, trying to find a shortcut to victory. Realistically, though, none of the players have shown the appetite to deal with North Korea in a sustained or prolonged way, knowing how difficult the situation is and lacking a sense of priority. They've wanted quick results, short negotiations, quick solutions, no obstacles, no challenges. They've wanted guarantees even before starting negotiations. And these attempts, even those that were actually productive solutions while they were in practice, such as the Agreed Framework, have fallen apart as soon as challenges have arisen. And in the meantime, North Korea has gotten stronger, because it can. It's kind of like treating a disease like tuberculosis. A TB patient needs consistent long-term drug treatment to manage the disease and potentially cure it. But if patients can't get their medication consistently, the disease can evolve over time until you have a multi-drug resistant strain that is even deadlier. So what is the nature of the problem today, and why do we obsess over North Korea's nuclear program? Well, based on North Korea's nuclear material production capabilities, experts estimate that North Korea currently has enough plutonium and enriched uranium to build an arsenal of roughly about 30 to 60 nuclear weapons. In addition, they have arsenals of operational short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles that can cover targets in South Korea and Japan. They have demonstrated road-mobile, solid-fueled intermediate ballistic missiles that could reach targets as far as Guam, and sea-launched ballistic missiles that diversify their delivery systems and make their program more durable and harder to protect against. And as of last year, they have demonstrated an intercontinental ballistic missile capability that can reach targets in the United States. Of course, there are always caveats as to how to assess the functionality of these systems, especially their reliability and accuracy. However, even with questionable accuracy, one would assume that they could be used in a pinch. But it's more than just weapons. The North Korean economy has also evolved and grown stronger over the years, especially during the Kim Jong-un era. Despite having been under sanctions for more than a decade, the economy has been growing and transforming into a more of a dual economic system. One part is still somewhat of a command or military economy, and the other part is a vibrant emerging market economy. Disposable income, especially in the capital and major cities, is common. Cell phones and smuggled technologies are prevalent, and status symbols such as fashion are important. Museums, amusement parks, and zoos, fun parks, and horse riding courses, even gyms, are no longer a frivolous thing, but more a normal part of everyday life. And while, yes, the country is poor, the people are in the best condition they have been in recent history. So while we embark on negotiations about North Korea's nuclear weapons program, you hear a lot of the critics say, well, this isn't new, and we've been here before. And the reality is that yes, we have been posed with this opportunity before, but this time is different. North Korea is much stronger, both in terms of its asymmetric capabilities and its economy, and thus its spirit and confidence, much stronger than it has been in past negotiations. More than that, there are so many things now that we don't know that would be critical to the success of policies to resolve this problem. That includes each other's threat perceptions and strategic interests. So going back to the principles I laid out at the beginning, while efforts have historically discounted the importance of what North Korea wants and why it wants it, I'm going to challenge you today to instead think about all the potential things North Korea might want. And I say might because the first lesson anyone seriously studying North Korea learns is that there's a lot we don't know. So anyone who says with certainty that this is why North Korea is doing something or this is what Kim Jong-un is thinking, you should seriously question. We certainly all have theories of what North Korea wants and why they seem to want it. But especially now, we are largely guessing. Some are, of course, more educated guesses than others. But North Korea today is not North Korea of 10 years ago, and especially not North Korea of 60 years ago. And yet many experts like to pose the idea that they know what North Korea wants now because they know what Kim Il-sung wanted when the state was founded. But a big factor that we don't know right now is what is Kim Jong-un's vision of North Korea and North Korea's place in the world. Kim Jong-un did not simply come in and follow his father's policy of Songun, or military first, but introduced a Byungchun policy, this dual development of the economy and of a credible nuclear deterrent against the United States. This was not the first time Byungchun has been the state policy. Byungchun was also the policy of Kim Il-sung, but at that time it was focused on military and economic development, not necessarily a nuclear deterrent. So unlike what many who discount North Korean agency prefer to believe, ideas and policies evolve with the times and with the people, even in North Korea. And so along those lines, we don't know much about Kim Jong-un himself. Very few foreigners have ever met him, either before or after he took power. And those who have, up until the last few months, were not in a position to have serious talks with him about threat perceptions or strategic interests to get a real sense of what was rolling around in his head. obviously now through 3 high-level summits, and the planning process for those 3 plus an upcoming USDPRK summit, we have gotten some hints of Kim Jong-un's thinking. But how much do we really know about his intentions versus his negotiating tactics and offers? There's deep debate and disagreement among experts as to why Kim is coming to the table now. What does he really want? What is he really offering? And those intentions matter if we're trying to craft successful strategies and policies. We knew very little about Kim Jong-un before he was named successor in 2010, and that was only 1 year before his father died and he took power. There were some profiles of when he was young and in boarding school in Switzerland, but mainly from secondhand sources. And there are big gaps in understanding how his life evolved from childhood to supreme leader. What we are learning about Kim Jong-un is that while we have seen signs that he does follow a similar logic to his father and grandfather, he is also proven to be bolder, more defiant, more willing to be confrontational, more strategic, and has a higher risk tolerance, both on the weapons and foreign policy side, but also domestically, giving greater space for economic experimentation, scientific development, and even showing some humility to the people, such as in last year's New Year's speech, where he acknowledged some of his goals had not been met. So then the question becomes, how did we go from Kim being the world's enemy #1 to everyone's best friend within a matter of 4 months? And what we see now during the summit process is everyone taking credit for bringing Kim to the table. The US likes to credit the Maximum Pressure campaign and Tough Talk for sharpening Kim's choices, believing he has no other options if he wants to keep his state alive. China takes credit for coming down harder on sanctions implementation, giving Kim Jong-un fewer and fewer choices for business if he really does care about developing or maintaining his economy. Japan, too, weighs in on their role on standing tough and united with the hardline approach to North Korea. South Korea's story is a little different. They credit Moon's skillful diplomacy as opening the door to talks and creating the diplomatic off-ramp needed to prevent what was barreling towards crisis from turning into conflict. But trying to pinpoint a singular reason and a singular actor to credit is a fool's errand. And while everyone is taking some credit, there is some truth to it all. This unique set of circumstances has worked in combination to create this current diplomatic opportunity. And we do seem to have turned away from what was a fast approaching prospect for war. But where are we going? And what is often missing from this debate over who brought this situation about is North Korea's perspective in all of this. What might be their reasons for coming to the table, as surely their reasons have to be more than just because they were being pressured to do so. So recognizing North Korean agency means that they have both strategic interests and the ability to affect their future. So to understand what their reasoning might be, let's look at some domestic factors. First, Byungtin is a dual-track development policy process. It does not mean that both parts are pursued at an equal pace. So while both are priority goals, when the political situation is good, the economy comes greater into focus. When the political situation is bad, the emphasis will be on the weapons development. What we have seen over the past year, as relations with the US worsened sharply during the Trump era, North Korea's pace of testing quickened. We saw new systems that were tested multiple times until they demonstrated a basic functionality. Then new systems were revealed and the process repeated. At that time, many experts theorized that Kim was likely going down the development road as quickly as possible. What we couldn't answer, though, was Kim's calculation of how much was enough. Last year, after demonstrating a thermonuclear or H-bomb in September, and then an indisputable ICBM design in November, Kim Jong-un declared his state nuclear force was complete. He had demonstrated the basic elements of a nuclear deterrent against the United States and fulfilled the nuclear part of his Byungtin policy. By doing this, and by declaring the program complete, It gives Kim Jong-un confidence. He's shown greater strength of his country's defenses, as well as the ability to deliver on his promises to the people. It also gives him now a sense of strategic parity with the big powers, who now have to deal with him as a de facto nuclear state and take his program seriously. And now Kim can focus on the other half of his state policy, the economic development, for which he will need to repair relations with the international community. But now Kim also has a lot of room to negotiate. He can essentially give up what looks like big diplomatic concessions to international actors, but can frame these concessions domestically in a way that doesn't look weak. For instance, this pledge to stop nuclear missile testing and shut down the nuclear test site at Punggye-ri. While it is an important step in a denuclearization process, Kim can frame that concession domestically as stopping testing because the development phase is complete. They don't need to test anymore, and they don't need the testing infrastructure. So how then do we take advantage of this opportunity, and what should we expect from North Korea going forward? Is denuclearization really possible? And to this end, we need to go back to the fundamental question of why does North Korea want nuclear weapons? For that, we have some theories. So for instance, one, there's likely a domestic political legitimacy and national integrity component, preventing foreign intervention and possibly internal factions from overthrowing the government or trying to attack the country. There may be a development component, having learned from China's experience of securing the country first through nuclear weapons, to be able to then turn the corner and focus on economic development once it feels safe from invasion. There's likely a foreign prestige component, a sense of strategic parity with its allies and adversaries, especially the big powers that often threaten its way of life. There's surely a self-defense and deterrent component. North Korea is the David among Goliaths. They've seen how the US treats little guys with governments they don't like. North Koreans have often commented on how they're the only country in Northeast Asia that didn't have either nuclear weapons or a nuclear umbrella by a proxy state, seated amid the economic and political giants, leaving them extra vulnerable in a nuclear neighborhood. And I would add to that, there's also likely a relevancy component to North Korea's behavior and choices. North Korea is a small country with a poor economy and limited natural resources. There's a sense within the regime that when they aren't behaving provocatively, the world, especially the United States, doesn't pay attention to them. So their nuclear weapons give them not only the prestige of being in the nuclear club, but greater relevance in a world that has largely moved past them. In fact, before last year, how much did you care about North Korea? How many of you would have come on a rainy Saturday night to listen to a lecture about North Korea? And are you really here because you care about North Korea and really fear its nuclear program? Or are you here because you worry that the US will start a war over this issue? And what this means is that realistically, any policy proposal or negotiated settlement, if we really want success, is going to have to address these overall principles. So it's important to note the specific language that the North Koreans use is not simply that North Korea will denuclearize unilaterally. There should be no illusion that they will enter negotiations, put their weapons on the table, and say, what can I get for this? Instead, they always talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which they contend is contingent on eliminating the hostile policy of the United States or on gaining credible security assurances. And let's be clear, despite the recent euphoria around North Korea after the Panmunjom summit, there's little actual trust among the key players. Security guarantees on paper aren't credible just because they're in writing. The North Koreans know better than anyone that agreements fall apart easily in the face of obstacles, especially from administration to administration in both the United States and in South Korea. President Trump's decision to violate the Iran deal only underscores the reversible nature of agreements, even multilateral arrangements. So for security guarantees to have meaning, There needs to be a fundamental change in the political relationship between our countries that builds up credibility over time. Only then would North Korea feel secure in a decision to disarm. And that's not going to be easy. In the Inter-Korean Summit just a few weeks ago, the two Korean leaders once again committed to finding solutions to end the Korean War and pave the way for a permanent peace arrangement. Past liberal presidents have also made these commitments with North Korean leaders, but turning those commitments into sustainable solutions have generally faced two key obstacles. The first is, in the past, the summits came at the end of the South Korean presidential term and were followed by conservative administrations who preferred a more hardline stance against the North. And the second, the question quickly arises, which comes first, peace or denuclearization? What are the implications of signing a peace treaty with a country that has an illegal nuclear weapons program? Does that legitimize and solidify their status as a nuclear-armed state? In the past, North Korea has often posed the sequence as peace must come first in order to justify our denuclearization. But what if a peace arrangement is achieved, but it is not followed by denuclearization? The stances in Washington and Seoul have wavered on this issue, at times one being willing to consider the North's proposition, usually to be undermined by the other. The question of peace treaty or peace declaration with North Korea is laden with other entanglements as well, including what then becomes of the U.S.-South Korea alliance and U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula, and what role does China play? The issue of North Korea's human rights record also comes up, especially over issues such as the detainees and abductees. There's been a tendency in this post-Panmunjom summit for people who express these concerns of what does a peace treaty with North Korea really mean to be characterized as colonizers trying to hold on to power over Korea or being against Korea's finding peace. But that's not the case. Simply, they are an acknowledgement that with peace must come a fundamental change in political relations. And so far, that change has been an uncomfortable thought, given the North's nuclear development and past history of military adventurism against the South. In looking ahead now to the upcoming US DPRK summit, the first of its kind, these are the issues that the Trump administration will have to wrestle with. Can we have peace before denuclearization? And what does that mean for the North's nuclear status and for the US-Korea alliance? What does complete denuclearization mean? And how long will it take to get there? And what is the threshold that the US and its allies are willing to live with on the scale of complete denuclearization?